December 20th, 1943. The sky over northern Germany was a freezing hellscape of black smoke, tracer fire, and death. At 27,300 feet above Bremen, where the outside temperature plunged to minus 60 degrees Celsius, a formation of B-17 flying fortresses from the 379th Bomb Group prepared to unleash their payload on the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory below. For 21-year-old Second Lieutenant Charles Charlie Brown, sitting in the left seat of a bomber christened Ye Olde Pub, this was his first mission as a pilot and aircraft commander, a baptism by fire that would become one of the most extraordinary encounters in aviation history. The pre-mission briefing had been ominous. Intelligence officers warned the crews they would face hundreds of German fighters and more than 250 flak guns defending Bremen. Brown's crew had been assigned to fly Purple Heart Corner, the exposed edge position in the formation that German fighters targeted relentlessly. It was the spot where bomber crews went to die. As Ye Olde Pub began its 10-minute bomb run, the world exploded. Accurate flak burst around them with devastating precision. Shrapnel tore through the aircraft's plexiglass nose, shredding it like paper. The number 2 engine erupted in flames and died. The number 4 engine, already temperamental, sustained further damage and had to be throttled back to prevent catastrophic overspeeding. With 2 engines compromised, the bomber immediately began losing speed and altitude, falling behind the protective formation like a wounded animal separated from the herd. Then came the fighters. More than a dozen Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s from Jagdgeschwader. 11 descended on the crippled B-17 like wolves. For over 10 minutes, they made repeated attack runs, their 20-millimeter cannons and machine guns hammering the bomber from every angle. The number 3 engine took hits and could produce only half power. Ye Olde Pub was now flying on barely 40% of its rated power, a death sentence at high altitude over enemy territory. Inside the bomber, it was carnage. The oxygen system was destroyed, leaving the crew gasping in the thin air. Hydraulic fluid sprayed through the cabin. Electrical systems sparked and failed. The aircraft lost half its rudder and the entire port elevator, making it almost uncontrollable. Cannon shells tore gaping holes through the fuselage, some large enough to crawl through. The bomber's defensive armament, 11 machine guns that were supposed to protect them, mostly jammed due to frozen mechanisms after ground crews had failed to oil them properly. Only the dorsal turret and 1 nose gun remained operational. The crew suffered horrifically. In the tail, Sergeant Hugh Sylvester Eckenrode never knew what hit him when a 20-millimeter cannon shell struck him directly, killing him instantly. Waist gunner Alex Yelisenko lay critically wounded, shrapnel having shredded his leg. Ball turret gunner Samuel Blackford's feet were freezing, the heated wiring in his flight suit having shorted out in the minus 60-degree cold. Navigator Al Pitchout had been struck in the eye by shell fragments. Charlie Brown himself took shrapnel in his right shoulder. At some point during the maelstrom, Brown lost consciousness from oxygen deprivation and blood loss. When he came to, the bomber was in a steep dive at just 1,000 meters, barely 3,000 feet, screaming toward the German countryside. Through sheer instinct and will, Brown pulled the shattered bomber level. The aircraft shuddered and groaned, barely holding together. Every control input required enormous physical effort with the destroyed flight surfaces. Brown faced an impossible decision. They could bail out, but several crew members were too wounded to jump, and abandoning them meant leaving them to die or be captured. They could try to reach neutral Sweden to the north, but that meant flying hundreds of miles over enemy territory in an aircraft that could barely fly. Or they could attempt the seemingly impossible, fly west to England across the breadth of Nazi Germany and the North Sea. Brown chose England. It was a choice born of loyalty, desperation, and the stubborn refusal to abandon his men. Ye Olde Pub limped westward, trailing smoke, hydraulic fluid, and fuel, flying so low that German civilians on the ground could see the destruction. The bomber was a flying wreck, held together by prayers and Charlie Brown's iron grip on the controls. At Oldenburg Airfield near Bremen, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler was refueling his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 when he heard the alert. Another crippled American bomber was in the area easy prey. For Franz, this could be the kill that earned him the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military honor. He needed just one more confirmed aerial victory to reach the threshold. One more bomber, and his name would join the elite ranks of the Luftwaffe's decorated aces. Franz Stigler was no novice. At 28 years old, he was a veteran fighter pilot with 27 confirmed victories and more than 30 probables. He had flown 487 combat missions across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and Western Europe. He'd been wounded 4 times and shot down 17 times, 4 times by enemy fighters, 4 by ground fire, and 9 times by American bomber gunners. He'd bailed out 6 times and crash-landed 11 more. He was a squadron commander who had led 3 different squadrons of JG-27, and he was tough, skilled, and utterly fearless. Franz had started flying gliders at age 12 and soloed in a powered aircraft in 1933 at 18. Before the war, he'd been a Lufthansa airline captain, flying commercial routes across Europe. When Germany went to war, Franz initially became a flight instructor. But after his younger brother August was shot down and killed over the English Channel while piloting a bomber, Franz requested combat duty. He wanted to fight, and he wanted revenge. Franz had learned his trade from some of the Luftwaffe's best. In North Africa, he'd served under Gustav Rudel, a legendary ace and commander who had finished the war with 98 victories. Rudel was different from many Nazi officers. He maintained a chivalrous code even in the brutality of aerial combat. Rudel had once told his pilot something that stuck with Franz forever. "If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself." To Rudel, there were rules even in war. You didn't murder helpless men, you fought with honor. Franz launched his Bf 109 and climbed, scanning the sky for the crippled bomber. Within minutes, he spotted it, a B-17 flying impossibly low, barely 1,000 feet above the ground, heading west. Franz maneuvered behind it, diving for an attack position on the bomber's vulnerable tail. His finger moved toward the trigger. This was the moment, the kill that would earn him the Knight's Cross. But as Franz closed to firing range, he noticed something wrong. The bomber's tail guns weren't tracking him. No defensive fire came. Franz pulled closer, confused. Through the massive holes torn in the B-17's fuselage, Franz could see inside the aircraft. What he saw stopped him cold. Bodies, blood, wounded men desperately trying to help each other. The tail gunner's position was empty, or rather, what remained of the tail gunner was slumped in a grotesque position. Franz could see crew members moving slowly, weakly, some clearly wounded. The bomber's entire tail section was shredded, its rudder half gone. One wing showed enormous battle damage. The aircraft had so many holes it looked like Swiss cheese. Franz pulled his Bf-109 alongside the bomber's left wing, about 20 feet away. He looked into the cockpit and locked eyes with Charlie Brown. The young American pilot's face was pale, exhausted, streaked with blood. Charlie stared back at the German fighter in shock and terror, certain this was the end. But Franz didn't fire. In that frozen moment, Gustav Rodel's words echoed in his mind, "You don't shoot a man in a parachute." To Franz, looking at that destroyed bomber and its dying crew, they were no different from men hanging helplessly from parachutes. They were defenseless. Finishing them would not be combat, it would be murder. Franz made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of shooting, he would try to save them. He gestured emphatically to Brown, pointing north toward Sweden, trying to signal that the Americans should divert to neutral territory where they could land safely and receive medical care. But Brown either didn't understand or refused. Ye Olde Pub continued flying west toward England. Franz realized the bomber would never survive the journey if German flak batteries spotted it. The coastal defenses would blow it out of the sky without hesitation. So Franz did something extraordinary. He moved his Bf-109 into close formation on the bomber's port side wing, flying so close that German anti-aircraft gunners could clearly see him. He was escorting the American bomber, protecting it with his presence. Inside Ye Olde Pub, Charlie Brown watched the German fighter with growing confusion and disbelief. What was happening? Why wasn't the Bf-109 attacking? Charlie ordered his dorsal turret gunner to track the German fighter with his guns, but hold fire, a warning not to try anything. The gunner complied, swiveling his twin .50 caliber machine guns toward Franz. Franz saw the guns pointing at him and understood the message. He stayed in position anyway. For several minutes that felt like hours. The two aircraft flew together, an American bomber and a German fighter, in surreal companionship over Nazi-occupied Europe. Franz escorted Ye Olde Pub past German flak positions, his presence ensuring that the gunners held their fire. He flew with them across the coastline and out over the cold waters of the North Sea. Only when they were safely beyond German airspace did Franz break formation. He pulled his Bf-109 closer one final time, looked directly at Charlie Brown, and raised his hand in a salute, a gesture of respect from one pilot to another. Then Franz banked sharply and disappeared back toward Germany, leaving the crippled bomber to its fate. Charlie watched him go, stunned. What he'd just experienced seemed impossible. A German fighter ace had spared them, escorted them to safety, protected them from German guns. Why? Who was this pilot? Charlie would carry those questions for the next 43 years. Olde Pub struggled across the North Sea, losing altitude with every mile. P-47 Thunderbolt fighters that had also participated in the Bremen raid spotted the devastated bomber and formed a protective escort, marveling at how the aircraft was still flying. On December 20th, 1943, the bomber landed at RAF Seething in Norfolk, England. Ground crews rushed to the aircraft and stopped in shock. The B-17 had taken over 400 hits from machine guns, cannons, and flak. The damage was so catastrophic that Olde Pub was immediately declared unflyable and never flew combat again. It was eventually scrapped for parts and metal. At debriefing, Charlie told his commanding officers what happened, that a German fighter had escorted them to safety instead of destroying them. The response was immediate and unequivocal. Never speak of this again. Don't tell the other crew members. Don't tell other pilots. If word spread that German pilots could show mercy, it might create dangerous sentiment among Allied airmen. The official narrative was clear and non-negotiable. There was no humanity in a German cockpit. The enemy was to be demonized, not humanized. Charlie obeyed. He completed his combat tour, flying more missions over Europe. After the war, he returned to West Virginia, attended college, then rejoined the Air Force in 1949 during the Korean War era. He served until 1965, retiring with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. Brown then joined the State Department as a Foreign Service officer, making trips to Laos and Vietnam during the Southeast Asian conflicts. He retired from government service in 1972 and moved to Miami, Florida, where he worked as an inventor. Charlie built a successful life, married, and raised a family. But the war never left him. His daughter would later recall her father's nightmares, waken in cold sweats, reliving the terror of that December day over Bremen. The PTSD haunted him for decades. And always beneath the trauma and the memories of combat was one persistent, haunting question. Who was the German pilot who saved us? Franz Stigler landed his Bf-109 near Bremen after escorting Olde Pub to safety. He said nothing to his commanding officers about what he'd done. He couldn't. What Franz had done was a court-martial offense in Nazi Germany, and the penalty was death by firing squad. Under military regulations, deliberately allowing enemy aircraft to escape was treason. If anyone discovered he'd spared 10 Americans, Franz would face execution. Franz kept the secret through the rest of the war. He continued flying combat missions, surviving Germany's desperate final years as the Reich collapsed around him. He saw the Luftwaffe lose more than 90% of its pilots. He watched his friends die, his country destroyed, his world turned to ash. Near the war's end, Franz was handpicked by General Adolf Galland to join JV-44, the Squadron of Experts, an elite unit of Germany's best aces flying the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter. Franz survived the war, which made him a statistical miracle. After Germany's defeat, Franz survived the chaos of occupation. In 1953, he immigrated to Canada, settling in Vancouver, British Columbia. He married, started a business, and built a new life far from the ruins of Germany. Like Charlie, Franz tried to move on, but the memory of that B-17, the massive holes in its fuselage, the wounded crew fighting to survive, the young pilot who looked at him through the cockpit window, stayed with him. Franz would later say he lost his appetite for the kill after that day. The sight of that shattered bomber and its dying crew changed something fundamental in him. Both men carried the memory in silence for decades. An encounter that lasted perhaps 10 minutes had marked them both permanently. In 1986, 43 years after the encounter, Charlie Brown attended a combat pilot reunion in Boston called Gathering of the Eagles. Boeing had organized the event to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the B-17's first flight in 1935, and veterans from across the country gathered to share stories. During the event, someone asked Charlie if he had any particularly memorable missions during World War II. Charlie thought for a moment, then told the story, the crippled bomber, the German fighter that appeared on their wing, the escort to safety, the salute. When he finished, people crowded around him with questions. How had he never tried to find this pilot? Who was he? Did he survive the war? For the first time in 43 years, Charlie realized he'd been carrying this question without ever seriously attempting to answer it. Charlie decided he needed to find the German pilot. He started with official channels, contacting the U.S. Air Force, writing to West German Air Force archives, requesting records from the Army Air Force's Historical Office. Surely someone, somewhere, had documentation of German pilots stationed near Bremen in December 1943. But months passed, then years, with no results. The records were incomplete, destroyed, lost, or classified. German military archives were scattered across divided Germany west and east behind the Iron Curtain. The Luftwaffe's detailed records had been destroyed during the war or captured by the Soviets. Finding one specific pilot from one specific day in 1943 proved nearly impossible. But Charlie couldn't let it go. His nightmares continued. The question haunted him. Who was that German pilot? In 1989, Charlie tried a different approach. He wrote a detailed account of the incident and submitted it to a newsletter circulated among combat pilots, both American and German veterans. The letter described everything he remembered, the date, the location, the circumstances, the BF-109's markings, the damaged B-17 limping home. He included one specific detail he remembered vividly. The German pilot had looked directly at him and given a salute before breaking away. Charlie sent the letter and waited. He was 67 years old. 46 years had passed since that day over Germany. The German pilot might be dead. He might never have survived the war. Even if he had survived, he could have died in the decade since. But Charlie had to try. In Vancouver, Canada, Franz Stigler was 74 years old. He'd also attended Boeing's 50th anniversary event in 1986, the only German pilot there among the American veterans. A local television station had interviewed him, and Franz had told his story on camera for the first time. The B-17 he spared, the decision he made, the risk he took. Franz had also been making quiet inquiries over the years, asking at Luftwaffe veteran associations and gatherings if anyone knew whether the bomber had made it back to England. He received no answers. In January 1990, Franz received the combat pilot newsletter. He read Charlie's letter and froze. The date matched perfectly. December 20th, 1943. The location matched near Bremen. The circumstances matched exactly. A crippled B-17 at low altitude escort to the coast. The salute. After 47 years, Franz knew the answer to his own haunting question. The bomber had made it home. The crew had survived. Franz sat down and wrote a letter. He sent it to Charlie Brown in Miami, Florida. On January 18, 1990, Charlie received an envelope postmarked from Canada. Inside was a letter that began with 4 simple words, "I was the one." When Charlie and Franz first spoke on the phone, the recognition was immediate and mutual. Franz described his aircraft and the encounter in precise detail. Every element Charlie needed to confirm this was truly the German pilot from December 20th, 1943. Franz explained that when he'd pulled alongside Olde Pub and seen the extent of the damage, when he'd looked through the holes in the fuselage and seen the desperate crew trying to save each other, he'd remembered Gustav Rödel's words, "If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself." To Franz, the men in that shattered bomber were no different than men hanging helplessly from parachutes. They were defenseless. They weren't a threat. Finishing them would have been murder, not combat. Franz told Charlie he'd tried to get them to divert to Sweden, but when the Americans kept flying toward England, he'd escorted them through German flak positions to protect them. As they talked, something profound shifted in both men. Charlie's nightmares began to ease. The question that had haunted him for nearly 5 decades finally had an answer, more than an answer. A name, a voice, a real human being. For Franz, hearing Charlie's voice meant everything. For 47 years, he'd wondered if his choice had mattered, if the bomber had crashed into the sea, if the crew had bled out before reaching England. Now he knew. They lived. All 10 men had survived. The 2 arranged to meet in person. 6 months later, in June 1990, they met in Seattle. Television cameras captured the moment. Franz stepped out of a car, saw Charlie, and ran to embrace him. The 2 men, once enemies, now brothers, held each other and wept openly. Franz turned to the camera and said softly, his voice breaking, "I love you, Charlie." They spent the day talking, filling in the missing years of their lives. Charlie introduced Franz to other members of his crewmen who were alive because of Franz's choice. Franz met their children and grandchildren to entire families that existed because one pilot had chosen mercy over murder on a frozen December day in 1943. The meeting proved profoundly healing for both men. Charlie said his nightmares stopped after finding Franz. For the first time in 47 years, he could sleep peacefully. Franz said that meeting Charlie and the crew was the only good thing that came out of World War II for him. He'd lost his brother August in the war. He'd watched the Luftwaffe lose over 90% of its pilots. He'd witnessed the total destruction of Germany and the collapse of everything he'd known. But saving these men, that was something he could be proud of. After 1990, Charlie and Franz became inseparable friends. They spoke on the phone every week. They traveled across the United States together, appearing at air shows, veteran gatherings, and civic events, telling their story to anyone who would listen. They wanted people to understand that even in war's darkest moments, humanity could prevail. During one visit, Franz gave Charlie a book. Inside, he'd inscribed, "In 1940, I lost my only brother as a night fighter. Thanks, Charlie. Your brother, Franz." The sentiment was simple but profound. Franz had found in Charlie a replacement for the brother he'd lost to war. The two families became close. Charlie's wife and Franz's wife became friends. The bond extended beyond the two pilots to everyone around them, proof that reconciliation and healing were possible even after the horror of total war. Not everyone understood or approved. Franz received phone calls from Germany calling him a traitor for sparing American bombers who were destroying German cities. Some Canadian neighbors shunned him, calling him a Nazi. Franz's response was always the same. They would never understand. For Franz and Charlie, the labels didn't matter anymore, German or American, enemy or friend. Those were just words from a war that had ended decades ago. What mattered was what happened on December 20th, 1943, when one man looked at another and chose humanity over duty. The friendship lasted 18 years. On March 22, 2008, Franz Stigler died in Vancouver, Canada. He was 92 years old. 8 months later, on November 24, 2008, Charlie Brown died in Miami, Florida. He was 86. They're buried thousands of miles apart, but their story remains inseparable. Two men who met for 10 minutes in combat in 1943 became brothers for the last 18 years of their lives. It took 47 years to find each other. They had 18 years together. Both died within 8 months of each other, as if neither could exist long without the other. Their story became a best-selling book titled A Higher Call, written by Adam Makos with Larry Alexander and published in December 2012. Makos spent years interviewing both men before their deaths, documenting every detail of their lives and the encounter that bound them together. The book introduced their story to millions who had never heard it. But the real legacy isn't the book or the fame or the recognition that came late in their lives. The real legacy is what Franz Stigler taught, that even in war, humanity can prevail, that you can wear an enemy uniform and still see the human beings on the other side, that sometimes the most heroic act isn't killing. It's refusing to kill when you have every reason and opportunity to do so. Franz Stigler risked execution to save 10 strangers. Charlie Brown spent 40 years searching for the enemy who became his brother. Their story reminds us that war, for all its horror, cannot completely extinguish the human capacity for mercy, honor, and love. That's not just a war story. That's a story about what it means to be human.